Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell, and this is going to be my November and December wrap up, as well as my Christmas book haul. I got 7 books for Christmas this year, as well as in December, I went to my favorite used bookstore on the entire planet and bought 4 books for myself. So I'll talk about all of those at the end. So if you were following my channel, you know I did NaNoWriMo in November. So I didn't read a whole lot in November. I did read 4 books total. 3 of those I already talked about in my Grand Canyon Zion reading vlog where we were exploring the national parks. So that was a super fun video. So my first book in November was Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is the first book in the Between Earth and Sky trilogy, and I absolutely adored this book. The very first chapter just starts off with a bang. It's set in the pre-Columbian era North America, is based on Native American societies and mythology. And the young boy that the story starts with, his mother tells him that he is the crow god reborn, and that he is basically a reincarnated version of a god that has been dormant for a very long time. The story skips around to different characters. There is a sun priestess who is one of the main characters, as well as a woman who is the captain of a ship. All their stories weave together. There is a lot of turmoil between different religions and different castes in society, and the entire book is a countdown that leads to the day of the solar eclipse, I guess, which is the day that the crow god is supposed to be reborn into the young man that we started the story with. So he's about 20 years old, I think, when that happens. And so the first chapter is his childhood, where his mother is telling him this, and something really traumatic happens right off the bat. And then it basically skips 20 years in the future, and every chapter is basically a countdown to this moment. I absolutely loved the world. I loved the countdown aspect of it. I thought everything about this book was just super unique and super cool, and I immediately jumped into book number 2 in the series, which is Fevered Star. Fevered Star didn't have those same 5-star feelings right away, just because it lost kind of that countdown aspect. The entire first book is like meeting these characters, and then they all kind of come together for this moment, this reincarnation, this a crazy turmoil that happens culturally and personally and all these things. And then because of those events, they're all pretty much immediately cast apart. They have different missions now. They have different things they need to do. And so in Fevered Star, the characters are not together. That just added some different dynamics. I did really enjoy Fevered Star, and I think it was a great setup for book 3, which is Mirrored Heavens, and that is supposed to come out in June this year. So I'm super excited to have the conclusion to this trilogy and see where it's going to go, because it has been a wild ride that I loved. The third book I read in November was The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a horror novel, and it is my first Stephen Graham Jones that I have ever read. It starts off with a Native American man who is beaten to death outside of a bar by a bunch of white men. And right before he is beaten to death, he hallucinates. There are elk all over the parking lot of this bar where he is killed. Then it switches to another man's perspective. He was a friend to the man who was killed. He is also a Native American. His story starts off with he's trying to fix just a busted light bulb in his living room, and he hallucinates also that he sees an elk in his living room. Throughout the story, you come to learn that 10 years prior, these 2 men that we have the perspective of, and also 2 additional friends of theirs, all went on this hunting trip together, and it went horribly wrong, involving some elk. I won't give anything away because learning what happened is part of the fun. The first half of the story really follows this guy. I think his name is Lewis, and he keeps seeing this elk, and he is just slowly losing his marbles, and you don't really know, is he a reliable narrator? Is he really seeing these things, or is he just going crazy? And then his part of the story comes to an end about halfway through the book and it switches perspectives again. And then all of a sudden, you as the reader really find out what is happening. And it is a wild, wild ride. I absolutely loved it. It was super tense. It was super unsettling. And it was just absolutely horrifying on a lot of different levels. There was some body horror as well. I was totally gripped. I did not want to put this book down. And despite how horrible and intense it was, this was absolutely one of my favorite books of the year. And I still like thinking back to some of the scenes, like, oh, I get the heebie-jeebies a little bit. It was so well written. I cannot wait to read more Stephen Graham Jones because of this book. And the ending it wasn't so bleak that I was left feeling like totally dejected at the end. There was at least a glimmer of hope. Absolutely would recommend, 5 stars. My fourth and final book in November was Bookshops Bonedust by Travis Baldree. This is the prequel to Legends and Lattes. And I loved Legends and Lattes last year. It was a cozy fantasy read that is about an orc woman who retires from her adventuring life and just wants to settle down and open a coffee shop. And it's about the friends that she makes along the way and how she like buys this old barn and turns it into her shop and all that kind of stuff. It's very cute and sweet. Bookshops Bonedust had a lot of those vibes, but the heart just wasn't there in the same way for me. The main character, Viv, it's the same main character. She's an orc, but it is a prequel, and so she is living the adventurous life, and she gets injured. And so her adventuring party that she's traveling with drops her off in a quiet seaside town in order to recover from her injury for maybe like 2 months or so, 6 weeks, so that she can recover from this injury in order to go back to the adventuring. Viv, the whole book just feels a little bit frustrated because she wants to be out adventuring with her crew and she's not able to do that because she's injured, and she feels a little bit like she's spinning her wheels. And even though she does make some really great friends and she helps restore a bookshop, and like it has all of those great bookshop vibes that you want, the characters in it are very cute. I think there was a lot to love about this, but it just didn't hit for me in the same way because the main character felt like she was spinning her wheels. I also felt a little bit adrift in this story. There were a lot of times when I was reading where I was just like, I just want something to happen and nothing was happening. And so, yeah, I think this was more of like a 3.5 star for me. But I do think if you love the first one, there's a good chance you will love this one just as much. And I've heard a lot of people rave about it. So it's not as good, but it's still worth the read. So that was November. In December, I managed to squeeze in 9 books, which was a little bit shocking, but I read exactly 100 books this year. So I read my 100th book like on December 30th. I actually tried to squeeze in 101, but I just couldn't quite do it on New Year's Eve. I only got about halfway through a book. So 3 of these books I've already talked about in my Christmas Classics reading vlog. But yeah, I'll go ahead and get those 3 out of the way. The 3 books that I read for the Christmas Classics reading vlog was A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Letters from Father Christmas by j.r.r. Tolkien, and The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus by L. Frank Baum. Of these, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens was absolutely wonderful. 5 stars, a classic for a reason. It's the tale that you know of Ebenezer Scrooge, the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future, and this man learning to overcome greed and find the meaning in life, which is generosity and family and friends and community. It's just absolutely wonderful. The descriptions are super vivid. It's very short read, and yeah, I loved it. There's nothing else to say. Letters from Father Christmas by j.r.r. Tolkien was a series of letters that the author wrote to his children. Every Christmas they would get a letter from Santa Claus, and it would tell of the incredible tales of what Santa Claus had been up to at the North Pole since they had heard from him last. And he had a very funny assistant called the North Polar Bear, and there were like gremlins or goblins that they kept having issues with and they were fighting. It was very whimsical and silly and fun. In addition to the letters, j.r.r. Tolkien also illustrated pictures for his kids. I don't necessarily think this is like a super compelling read. You know, it's not like there's a real plot or like anything, you know, it's just kind of one-off letters. But I think this would be a really lovely coffee table book during the holidays if you're looking for something like that, because it is a super engaging flip through, especially if you have someone in your life who is a huge fan of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I'm sure they would think this was really, really cool. The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus by L. Frank Baum. This is the author of The Wizard of Oz, and it is a fairy tale. It is about Santa Claus. He was a human child that was dropped off at the edge of a fairy wood, and the nymphs that lived there adopted him and raised him, and then he was like slowly introduced to the world of man. He decided to help children by making toys for them, etc., etc. I found this to be really kind of bizarre. There was no real stakes. Yeah, it just had, you know, in the kind of way of fairy tales going sometimes, it was just like a series of events that happened and not really like a compelling story. It was very mediocre. I gave it just 3 stars. But it was a middle grade book, and maybe if I had read it when I was a middle grade aged person, that I would have thought it was a lot cuter than it was for me now. Okay, moving on to the books that I have not already talked about on the channel. I read The Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor. This is a science fiction book about a hyper-intelligent species of octopus that are discovered living off the coast of an island in Asia. It's about the scientist who is brought to study the octopus civilization and her attempting to learn how to communicate with them. Also, the island is owned by a giant corporation, and the scientist is also, I think, trying to figure out why this corporation wants the island, because they only bought it recently, and what is their motivation for wanting to know more about the octopi. Are they trying to exploit them? You know, are they going to conserve the species the way that they need to because they are so unique? There was also, the only people on the island are the scientist. There is an android character who is like the only android in existence. After the android was created, it became a huge spectacle and was outlawed internationally in like most countries. People were so unsettled by the android that they made it illegal for people to make more of them. But the android is also a scientist in its own right, and it is owned by the corporation that owns the island. So that's where it lives. And then the third person on the island is like the defender of the island, who is a soldier basically, and she is extremely well trained in running all these different like drone type technologies that can keep away like illegal fishermen and anyone who might try to sneak onto the island to investigate for themselves. In some ways, there's a lot of different things happening, and in some ways, it's literally just like this tiny island with 3 people on it. I had some mixed feelings about this book. I think just because my expectations were a little bit different than what my experience reading it was. I really enjoyed the story. There were so many great like fundamental philosophical questions that I love in sci-fi. You know, what does it mean to be human, which was played out from different angles, both in terms of the android character, but also the octopus themselves. You know, what is the nature of consciousness, basically, and like, if you think, therefore I am, that kind of thing. The aspects where the scientist was trying to learn to communicate with the octopus reminded me a lot of the movie Arrival. So I definitely think if you're a fan of that, you could potentially really find something you love in this book. However, communication was not really achieved by the end of the book, and so that was a little bit disappointing. Even though it made sense for the story, it wasn't what I expected or what I wanted to happen. In addition to the philosophical things that the book was tackling, there was also all of these environmental issues, you know, conservation and human impact on the planet and endangered species and all these different sorts of things. There were so many good conversations to be had. I actually think this would be a really great book club selection, because it would be really fun to discuss with other people all the different themes that were happening in this book. But the ending was a little bit unsettled in terms of, I didn't necessarily feel like there was a conclusive end. It wasn't even that it was left open-ended either necessarily. It was just that I felt like the entire time I was reading the book, even when I was like 90% of the way done, that the book was just getting started. I really felt like this could have been a series or a much longer book than it was, because in the end it just didn't end how I wanted it to. So I gave it 4 stars. It was a very thought-provoking read. It had so many great quotable lines. I'm definitely interested to read more by this author in the future, but it wasn't the 5-star that I hoped it would be. I read one nonfiction book in December. It was called Disfigured by Amanda Leduc, and the subtitle is On Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. Basically, Disfigured is exactly like the subtitle says. It's about the representation of disabled people in fairy tales. It talks about a lot of different types of fairy tales, but specifically like the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, the ones that Western peoples know most well. The main kind of thesis for this book was that disabled people or disfigured people or very hideously ugly people in fairy tales are often that way because they were punished by others, by a witch, by a god or a fairy or whatever. And if the character who is very disfigured or disabled or very ugly is an extremely virtuous character, then usually at the end of that fairy tale, they are cured of that disfigurement. So that was really interesting to have that pointed out. And then, of course, the author used dozens of examples, which were very interesting. And then also talked about, the parallels between these and Disney fairy tales and, other ways that this has infiltrated our culture and how it makes us view disability a certain way because these stories are so pervasive in our society. I thought it was a really enlightening read. I would highly recommend it to anyone who likes fairy tales or Disney movies or just wants to know more about what it's like being a disabled person in Western society, especially if you are potentially a writer or an author and you are considering using a disabled character in your book. I think this is a very important pre-reading. The next 3 books that I read were a series, and it was Red Rising Era 1. So the first 3 books, there are going to be 7 books total in the Red Rising saga, and that is split into Era 1, which is the original trilogy, and then there's Era 2, which is 4 books. 3 of those 4 books are out, and the 4th one I think is either coming out in 2024 or 2025. A lot of people were talking about that series this year because the 6th book just came out, the 3rd book in the 2nd era, and I have had this on my radar for a really long time, and I really wanted to get to it. So I did read the first series in Red Rising in December. I had heard also that even if you didn't necessarily love the first book, that this series just gets better and better and better. So I was encouraged by that. And I knew that Red Rising has my absolute least favorite trope of all time, which is fridging. And fridging is where a woman character who's usually like a wife, a mother, or a daughter, is killed right at the beginning of the story. And basically the only purpose that that character serves in the story is to motivate a male character into action. So that happens in Red Rising. That's not really a spoiler. It's in the listed on the back of the book. The general premise behind Red Rising is that society is split into multiple different castes. Castes are named by color, and the Reds are the lowest caste. They are basically slaves, but they don't really know that. They are a mining community under the surface of Mars, and they believe that they are terraforming the planet so that someday the other caste can move to Mars and live there and prosper. What they don't know, and which our main character finds out very quickly, is that Mars has already been terraformed for 700 years. And everyone else is up on the planet's surface thriving, and his society, the Reds, are just slaves. So that's obviously a very disturbing realization, and he escapes from the mines after his wife is killed and learns all of this, and he joins the Sons of Ares, which are the resistance movement that are trying to change the way society works. And in order to do that, when he joins the Sons of Ares, they do all of this really intensive surgery on him and basically transform him into a gold, which is the highest tier, the leadership caste of society. So book 1, I often hear compared to a Hunger Games style story where the main character Darrow, after becoming a gold or being transformed to look like a gold, then goes to a school where all golds are sent if they want to be the leadership of the golds. And it's very brutal. A lot of the students die because they only want the strongest people to be the leaders of their society. So that's basically book one. Aside from the fridging trope, which I was prepared for and was like, it's fine, we'll get there, or we'll get through it. This first book also just had like a god-awful amount of just like casual sexism. The phrase cried like a girl, laughed like a girl, fought like a girl, all of those sorts of phrases were used and a huge number of times in this story. I honestly felt like I wanted to stab my eyes out every single, like it just happened so much that the characters spoke like this, and it wasn't just like one character and that was, you know, a quirk of their personality. It was clearly like the sexism of the author just coming through on the page. So that was a struggle a little bit to get through. And so as much as I really loved the plot and the setting and the like ideas behind what were happening in the story, I was pretty fed up with the sexism of it by the end. And so I ended up only giving Red Rising like a 3.75. I really wanted it to be like a 5-star, but it was just too much. And I feel like Pierce Brown, the author, must have gotten that feedback from a ton of his readers, because everything that I had a problem with in book one was completely absent in the second and third book, which was great. It was like a real glow up for the series. Not only did the casual sexism disappear, but I felt also the writing just got better. And so I'm super happy that I pushed through, because the second book was like, wow, that was super, super cool. The second book is called Golden Sun. Darrow, the main character, has finished all of his kind of school trials, and now he is trying to infiltrate society and gain power in order to overthrow the Golds and the caste system that they all live with. I really don't want to say too much more about the series because I don't want to give away any spoilers that aren't already obvious from the first book. But the second book was just action-packed from start to finish. There were so many surprising turns and twists. I absolutely had no idea where the story was going. It just built and built and built and was just super awesome. There's space battles, there's political intrigue. It's awesome. And then the third and final book of Era 1, Morning Star, I felt like was a really good conclusion to the series. It left off in a way that was satisfying. I think you could easily only read Era 1 and feel that that was a good conclusion to the series. So I don't know if the author had originally planned to do an Era 2 or not. I haven't really looked into that, but I feel at the moment like satiated on Red Rising, and I will probably wait until I know when the 7th or 4th book of Era 2 is coming out before I start on Era 2, but I do plan to get to Era 2 in 2024. So very excited about that. I've heard that Era 2 is like even crazier and darker and grittier, and that's super exciting. I would recommend the Red Rising series now having read it, but with the caveat that book one is cringy, but it is absolutely worth it to push through because the rest of the series was phenomenal. Phew, we're almost there. The last book that I read in 2023 was Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries. I had not been planning to read this book this year, but I needed a 100th book. I had read 99 books after finishing Red Rising, and I was like, I gotta hit 100. I'm so close. And this was just a book that I heard a lot of really good things about this year. It was a new release. I just wanted to see what all the hype was about. So I picked this up and it was great. The hype is deserved. Emily Wilde is a professor at Cambridge University, and her life's work is to create an encyclopedia of all of the fake creatures that exist. There's never been a book like this before. This is set obviously in like an alternative early 1900s. So she has been traveling all around the world to catalog all of these different fake creatures. And like any good Fae story, the Fae they're very mischievous. They're sometimes evil or incomprehensible. Their motives are incomprehensible to humans. Therefore, they seem sometimes evil. There's lots of different types. They're not all good or all bad, but they are very morally gray, and that creates some really interesting scenarios. Emily Wilde herself is extremely devoted to her scholarly pursuits. That's like really the only thing that she cares about. She is a little bit coded as a character that's potentially on the spectrum. and that she just doesn't really understand social cues. She has a really hard time making small talk with people. She doesn't really like talking to people. She'd rather just be alone with her books all the time. And so that makes some really interesting dynamics with the village that she visits in order to catalog the fairies that she is pursuing. It is in like kind of an Arctic, like maybe like a Finland or a Norway type area is kind of the vibe that I was getting. And so it's a great wintertime read, which I wasn't expecting. The fae creatures are terrorizing this little town that she has gone to in multiple different ways. And so she's trying to get to the bottom of why that's happening and how they can stop that from happening in the future. In the meantime, she also has a fellow professor named Wendell Bamblebee, which is just a fun name to say. She considers him her only friend, but he also just like gets on her nerves, and she considers him a bit of an academic rival at the same time. But he's just like relentlessly charming, and he's not as good of a scholar as her, but he's like so good with people that their dynamic together surprising in a lot of ways. And there's a little bit of like a slow burn romance that happens. Emily Wilde does go into the fae realm in this story, and there were definitely some parts that were unsettling, but it also had like a heartwarming dose of like cozy vibes. I think if you like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, like all the fae aspects of that book and all the like scholarly womany vibes of A Natural History of Dragons, I think this book is like a perfect marriage of both of those things, and I loved all three of these books. If any of that sounds interesting, I would highly recommend it for sure. Shoo, so that's all the books that I read in November and December and closing out my 2023 with exactly 100 books, which was just awesome to have gotten there this year. So now for my book haul, I'll go through these pretty quickly because this has already been a long video. But if you saw my last video, which was 2024 goals and priority series, if you watch the priority series part of that video, I got 2 of my priority series for Christmas, which was super exciting. The first of those is The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. My parents got me the floppy paperback edition of all 4 of the Stormlight books that are out so far. Book 5, the final book in Stormlight Era 1, is supposed to come out in December. So I can't wait to read all of these tomes. How many? Yeah, I think each one is over 1,000 pages. So this is going to be a good chunk of my reading year this year for sure. But I'm so excited to dive into Stormlight for the first time. So The Way of Kings is the first one, followed by Words of Radiance, and then number 3 is Oathbringer, and number 4 is Rhythm of War. So yeah, these are huge, but I'm so happy to have the floppy paperbacks because this will make them a lot easier to read. And there's like really cool art on the inside. I didn't even realize this until literally just this moment. So that's super exciting. I can't wait to find out who these characters are and what all of that is about. Yay. I love getting books for Christmas. Oh, the sun. The other series that I got off my Christmas wish list, my priority series for 2024, was The Book of Ice by Mark Lawrence. So if you saw my last video, as I said, The Book of Ice is in the same world as Book of the Ancestor trilogy, which I read in 2022 by Mark Lawrence. I think this follows completely different characters, but I haven't really looked into it that much. But I loved Book of the Ancestor. That was the series that started with Red Sister. I still think about those books quite a lot. So I'm very excited to dive into another series by Mark Lawrence. So it starts with The Girl and the Stars, and then we have The Girl and the Mountain, and finally The Girl and the Moon. Super excited. I'm probably going to start reading these right away because the series is called The Book of Ice, and it's wintertime right now, so it seems like a good time to dive in. Okay, that was all of the books I got for Christmas, but I did buy 4 books for myself in December because I took a little trip to the International Book Project, which, as I said, is my favorite used bookstore. So if you're ever in Lexington, Kentucky, all of their hardback books are $5 and all of their paperback books are $3. They have amazing, like, great condition books, and they're just able to pull that off because they're an amazing nonprofit with a mission of getting books into the hands of people who need them. So definitely check them out. Donate if you're ever looking for a charity. Anywho, I'm never sure how to say the title of this. I think it's 1Q84. 1Q84, I think, is the title. It is, from what I know, this is a big chunker of a sci-fi. It is by Haruki Murakami, which is an author that I've heard quite a lot about. But I believe this is inspired by 1984 and is obviously very different though. And I think there's like potentially like a parallel world dynamic that's happening, or like a alternate reality, or potentially maybe like a virtual reality. I'm not exactly sure. I believe it follows two characters who are trying to figure out if the world they're in is real or how it's different from the world that they're from. I don't really know. I just know that so many people rave about this book and call it one of the best sci-fi books of all time, or at least one of the best modern sci-fi books. And I want to see what all the buzz is about. I've heard that it is extremely complicated read, so definitely I'm going to save this for a time when I'm feeling like I have the brain power to tackle it appropriately. All right, the second book is A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie. I just love the cover of this. It's a beautiful hardback, and this is, I think, book one of the final trilogy in the First Law world, which again was on my priority series for the year. I have 2 more books in the First Law world that I have to finish before I get to this one, but excited that the International Book Project had like a really nice edition of it for me to add to my collection. And then the final 2 were not books that I had really anticipated reading in 2024, but now I bought them, so I'm going to try and squeeze them in. The first of those is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. This, from what I understand, is a book about slavery era United States or slavery era America, I guess. It is about an enslaved person who is trying to escape to freedom, but it is like an alternate magical realism type world in which there really is an underground railroad, as in like there's a train that exists underground that is only known about by like abolitionists and freed enslaved peoples. So that sounds super cool. And this book has gotten a ton of praise. It won the Pulitzer Prize and it's supposed to be really awesome. So I definitely want to give this a shot. And the final book is The Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. This was a Booker Prize finalist, but I actually heard about this on Reagan's channel, The Peruse Project. She read this and really enjoyed it. And from what I understand, this is basically like an adjacent Amelia Earhart type character, where this woman tries to be the first person to circumnavigate the globe in an airplane. She disappears, and the book is told both from her perspective and then like maybe 50 years or so in the future, also from the perspective of the actress who was cast to play her in like a biopic movie. That's all I really know, but I heard it was great, and I like something about the cover is just like really cute and appealing to me, so I picked it up. Oh, okay, so that's everything. That was my wrap-up book haul. I hope you all also got some books that you were excited about for Christmas this year, and happy 2024. I can't believe we're all here, and hopefully you've already had a great 5-star read to kick off your 2024. Thanks so much for tuning in. Let me know if you got any books for Christmas that you're really excited about, and as always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you soon.